Hi, welcome to RTO Doctor. This is our 7th podcast, and today we are going to be covering 5 habits of highly effective education executives. So let's get straight into it. Today we're going to be talking about 5 different areas that we often find and work with CEOs when we're going in to do rectification work or when we're going in to do some business improvements. At the face of them, they seem to be very generic areas, and they seem to be areas where most people would go, well, of course, common sense, we make sure that we do this. But when we delve into them a little bit deeper, what we quite often find is that there are some gaps. By being a little bit more proactive and being aware of these sorts of things, you can make your business run a lot more smoothly. You can mitigate your risk substantially. So the first one that we often talk to them about is whether or not they actually have an understanding of what their responsibilities are under the standards. That might be VQF or that might be AQTF, depending on whether you're under the state or national regulator. And then also what their responsibilities are from a legislative point under the NVETR Act. Okay, so for those of you that aren't familiar with all the acronyms, that's the National Vocational Education and Training Regulator Act. The reason why we actually bring up this act is because what we find is that a lot of CEOs, a lot of senior managers in particular, don't know what their liabilities are underneath this actual act. So one of the things that we first try and do is actually make that very clear to them what their responsibilities are and what the consequences are for things that may potentially go wrong. One of the biggest things that often surprises CEOs and executives to understand is that not only are they liable for the decisions of the company, but they can be personally, financially liable for those decisions too. Okay? No, you're not misunderstanding me. It means that if you are aware that your organization is breaching the VQF, that you personally, as an executive officer, can be financially responsible for those decisions. Okay, so let's take one of the more worst case scenarios, and we'll preface all of this by saying that to our knowledge, no person has actually been fined by ASQA at this point in time. The reason why we make people aware of this is because depending on the severity of a breach, it is one of the options that's available to the regulator, and it really brings home for executives the importance of having an understanding of the VET Act, the VQF, and the standards that they have to operate under. Okay, so again, let's go back. Let's take an example, an RTO that perhaps is delivering a qualification. That qualification lapses in its scope. So for example, it goes past that 12-month teach-out period and you continue to teach a qualification that is no longer technically on your scope. Okay, that is allotted with 600 civil penalty points under the NVETR Act. The civil penalty point at the moment, I believe, is around $160. So 600 times 160, you've got $96,000 that your organization might be liable for. The executive officers, it's up to 1/10 of that amount. Okay, so that's $9,600. I don't know about anybody else. That's not something that I would be comfortable with. I wouldn't be comfortable with the breach to begin with, but certainly knowing those additional financial disadvantages that are attached to that is some fairly strong additional incentive to make sure that your organization is not committing any breaches. That is not as a whole. That can actually be done per offense. So if you've put through a student, particularly in a case where they may find out that you were aware of the breach and you continued making the breach, or you made no actions to stop that procedure from happening and to fix it, then it would definitely be something that they could look at. Okay, so that's one of the first things, is actually having an idea of what your responsibilities are under the Act, what the consequences are of not abiding by those responsibilities, and making sure that you act in accordance with them. The second one that we're going to talk about is knowing your staff's responsibilities. Okay, what we will often encounter at this point is, particularly within the larger organizations, that can become quite difficult. We're not talking about going down to a level of detail where you are physically checking on every single one of your staff members. Okay, it's not reasonable once you get to a certain size organization, and it actually doesn't make sense from a business perspective. Okay, what you want to be doing is you want to be delegating that out, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But having an awareness of what all of the different job roles are within an organization, you should be aware as a CEO what your trainers' responsibilities are, so maintaining their currency, making sure that they are competent in all the qualifications, that they have the qualifications. And again, that might not be you directly checking all of them, but you should have processes in place so that you're aware that those things need to be checked, okay? Again, this just goes back to the fact that at the end of the day, you're responsible for what happens within that organization. Therefore, if you're not aware of what the responsibilities are, you don't know what policies and procedures need to be in place to make sure that they're being checked up on, okay? Don't be the bottleneck, and this is kind of the opposite of point two. What we tend to see this in is this tends to be more in organizations that start out very small. A lot of private RTOs will start out with a group of maybe anywhere from 2 to 5 key people. As the organization grows, the staff may grow out to 10, 15, 20, 50, whatever it may be. But the bulk of the information still stays with those 2 to 5 key people, okay? Therefore, the decisions can't happen until those 2 to 5, or, you know, worst case scenario, 1 key person signs off on it. What you want to be able to balance when you're growing your organization is that you're getting the balance of making sure that you're building your staff capability, okay? So making sure that staff have the processes and procedures in place to be able to sign off on some of those, you know, smaller tasks. One good example might be that, you know, if finance is having an issue with a student, they are approved to provide discounts of up to X amount of dollars, okay? Or they, you know, with marketing, they are approved to, you know, again, discount courses up to, you know, X amount of dollars, or that trainers can change units within the training package rules, you know, here, there. Allowing set parameters for that, but also then still allowing those decisions to be made, okay? And again, that kind of boils back to the RTO management system that you have in place, making sure that you've got strong policies and procedures that take into account all of those situations. If your RTO management system, essentially your business management system, boils down to 12 pages, it's not going to cover all of those scenarios. It's not going to cover all of the legislation. If it's 50 pages, it probably won't cover it. What you need to be making sure is that you've got a system that's fairly comprehensive. Okay, the better ones, certainly the better ones that we've seen, will take into account all the different job roles. You need to be making sure that you've got good solid position descriptions around that and those sorts of things as well. Now when we say don't be the bottleneck, again, this boils down to, you know, making sure that you've got staff roles, duties and processes, but it leads into our fourth point as well, which is learn to delegate, but still check. Okay, so we need to be growing staff capability. You need to be making sure that you're increasing the knowledge base of the organization, but you also want to be making sure that you've got checks in place to make sure that people aren't running wild underneath that. Quite often when you've got RTOs that go through a large period of growth, and if you're an organization that perhaps has, you know, received a large amount of funding within a small period of time, you might have to take on significant extra staff in order to be able to accommodate that. That's often when we find that we have particular areas that might start to operate unto themselves, okay? So if you've got your staff, you want to be making sure that you've got a strong senior management team who is delegating and who is checking on them on a daily basis. So a good example of this might be that you've got a training and assessment manager. That training and assessment manager might go out, do spot checks, so they might, you know, choose 2 trainers at random per month to go out and make sure that they're teaching to the course materials. They might pull out 3 or 4, depending on the size of the organization, student records at random to make sure that the unit choice for the students is compliant, that all the enrollment information is being provided, okay, that the qualification is being issued correctly, okay. That information is then being filtered back to you on a quarterly basis or as needed, okay. And again, that's then your responsibility to be checking on that through things like annual audits, okay. If it has been more than 2 years, or if it's been even more than a year, okay, or 18 months since you've run an internal audit within your organization, it's really important that you set up those annual internal audits. taking feedback from your students and your staff, that you're monitoring that, and that you're continuously acting on that feedback. Okay, that's within the VQF standards as well. The last point around that is if you're an organisation that perhaps has had 2 or 3 or more years since you have been fully audited, particularly if you've moved from being under a state regulator to being under a national regulator, prior to your next audit, make sure that you get somebody to come in who has recently been through an audit. That might be somebody else from industry that you know and work with, perhaps a partnership organisation. There are several peak bodies that offer kind of RTO health check services. Certainly we do at RTO Doctor as well. But make sure that you get somebody in who's been through a recent audit, who knows what the key areas are that auditors look for. And we will be doing a future podcast on the key areas that auditors are focusing in on at the moment. But make sure that you go through that process, because what was acceptable 3 years ago is not acceptable now to the large majority of auditors, okay? They do look at different areas, they do have different standards, and it's really important that you are aware of those so that you can prepare effectively for them. The last one that I'm going to talk about is linking in with industry. And quite often what we see when we go into organisations is we see fantastic links into industry. You might be training in manufacturing, you've got several clients, several employers that you regularly work with on, you see them on a monthly basis, you check in with them, you know what's happening in that industry. When it comes to the VET side of things, similar to how the trainers work, and if you want more information about that, go back to our trainer and assessor podcast, that's an area where things start to fall down, okay? Not being aware of what your responsibilities are, not being aware of changes in the Act. So there's a couple of fairly easy things that you can do. The first thing I would recommend is make sure that you're signed up for the ASQA newsletter and ASQA updates, okay? They've put out a couple of videos now, which are very good resources for anybody who's preparing for an ASQA audit. They do put out newsletters, and they put out, emails whenever there's a major change that needs to be notified. Find out what training packages you are running under. Find out what the ISC is, the Industry Skills Council, is for those training packages, and sign up for your training package updates, okay? A flip side of that is also that what you'll often find is that any awards, ceremonies, national conferences, quite a lot of the ISCs also put out free professional development opportunities. You can access this by signing up for their newsletters as well. So not only is it valuable from a compliance perspective, but it does also allow you a few really strong business opportunities and networking opportunities as well. The last thing that I would recommend is that at least once a year you try to attend a conference, okay, within the VET sector. There are several really good conferences this year. The 2 national ones that I would recommend are the VELG National Conference, which is happening in September, and EduTech, which is happening in July. Both of those have some fantastic speakers lined up. There is, anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 professionals that are going to be across those 2 functions. So it's a great opportunity for you to network. Quite often we get RTOs that go to these events and find some great partners, whether that's with public or private providers. Partnership opportunities quite often will start at these sorts of conferences. You'll often find that the regulators will come and speak at them. They'll run specialty seminars for a range of different business topics. They'll provide updates to legislation, and it's a really fantastic all-around opportunity. So make sure you try and get to one of those. The states will generally each provide one as well. WA's is going to be coming up on May 18th and 19th, so try and get to one of those as well. Okay, so those are your 5 points for today. So like we talked about, make sure that you're aware of your responsibilities. We do have links in the show notes to that NVETR Act, and we talk about the sections that are going to be relevant for executive officers or high managerial agents. Know what your staff's responsibilities are. Don't be the bottleneck for your organisation. Okay. Learn to delegate but check. Make sure that you've got strong processes, procedures, checks and balances behind that, and get linked in with industry. Okay. Thank you very much. If you have any questions about today's podcast, please feel free to email me at lauren@rtodoctor.com.au. You can also follow us or follow myself or Raylene personally on LinkedIn, Facebook or Twitter. Thank you.